Welcome, Brant Houston.
Hi. Hi, everybody. Obviously, I've been around a long time. I've worn several different hats, and I know this is all about nonprofits. And I had no expectation of being a journalist when I got out of college. I thought I'd try it for 2 years and go to law school or something else. That ended up being a multi-decade decision. When I went to Investigative Reporters and Editors to run a data journalism training program across the country, I thought I'd do that for 2 years. That went on for about 14. And that's where I really learned the nuts and bolts of running a nonprofit association. So I continued to do investigative reporting, but I really became a nonprofit business person. Also, when I became executive director, we'd had some disruption about whether to move the place from Missouri to Maryland. And so during all that debate, we'd lost membership. So when I came in, I wanted to build the membership back up. When I got there, that was the first major grant IRE, Investigative Reporters and Editors, had ever gotten to hire me. And when we became sort of a machine of fundraising grants for general operations, increasing donations, and then in 2001 really launched a major endowment campaign. So I think that's where we are really on the same wavelength in terms of the kinds of things you're doing in this class. I then became night chair in 2007, and there was the Great Recession in 2008. And at that point, there were a whole number of journalists getting laid off, or they couldn't do the kind of in-depth work they wanted to do. And we basically created a nonprofit newsroom movement. We started with 25 in 2009. There are now 500 or so thoroughly vetted, independent, transparent nonprofit newsrooms as a part of something called the Institute for Nonprofit News. So a lot of experience in the nonprofit world. You know, I get one day and I've got my nonprofit hat on and I've got my investigative hat on, and I go back and forth. I was very involved with the nonprofit movement more than I thought I would be, because I was popular. I'd been an investigative reporter, I was a journalist, and I had run a nonprofit and raised millions of dollars at Investigative Reporters and Editors. So if you're starting a nonprofit, I and another guy named Chuck Lewis, we were the popular people. We'd done both things. We like to help people start up things, and when we like to raise money. So that's how I got really involved with all of this. I also want to say, I'm not going to just rattle on for a long time, and questions and back and forth would be great. I do think I have a lot of experience in building up organizations and having strategies on how to get your name out there, how to market it, working with donors, and so I'm happy to share that. This is a piece of a webinar. This is work in progress. A webinar I'm going to do for the University of Texas International Journalism Center. So this is aimed mostly at U.S. journalists, but it's also incorporates some international information. This is just one of the presentations I'm doing with another person who's executive director of the Institute for Nonprofit News for years. So, any case, so this one is just one of the presentations. I'll just pop into it, just show you a sample. So this is, let's see, this will be module 2. We have 4 modules. The first one is a lot about nuts and bolts and principles of starting up a nonprofit, in this case a nonprofit newsroom. This one is specifically aimed at how to deal with foundations and major donors and individual donors. The third module, which my partner in this, Sue Cross, is doing, is really will focus on earned revenue, which is, you know, what everybody wants in a nonprofit. Of course, you can't run a nonprofit on earned revenue, otherwise you would be a for-profit. So I keep having to explain to some people that the reason we have all these nonprofit newsrooms is because the business model for newspapers and somewhat for broadcasting has thoroughly failed. So does anyone know that story at all? 90% of revenue for newspapers came from advertising. The web came along, and there's several other major strategic things that newsrooms didn't do. But if you lose, 70, 80% of your revenue, there was still some advertising. How do you replace that revenue? And that was the big thing that's been happening for the last 30 years. I call it one of the longest death spirals in history of an industry. So we've had all these people transition into the nonprofit world, hoping that we'll find a way to create for-profit news, of which there may be a new model there, but we haven't found a really reliable one yet, especially for local news. So in this part, this is aimed at people who are just doing a startup. Maybe they served on a local nonprofit, but this is all kind of new stuff. So this one is like how to approach and build major funder relationships, and this isn't going to be long, so it will be a lot of time to talk. And basically building relationships with major individual donors and getting corporate funding options. So what we do, and I think it's a good thing to do in any industry when somebody's getting a nonprofit, is let them know what skills they already have, and they can apply these. For journalists, we keep saying, you've never been in a business, you've never run a business, and it is a business. You have a lot of skills when it comes to fundraising. You can use journalist skills to interview and cultivate people. That's what you do in journalism. You're interviewing people, you're cultivating sources, you're building relationships, you're finding common ground. So that's really key. In an earlier module, I also talked about using your research skills. If you're a journalist, you spend all the time researching things you don't know anything about. So research the people that you're going to go talk to about contributing to what you do. And again, in an earlier module, you're a storyteller, and basically you need to tell the story of your nonprofit and why it's valuable and why people should support it. So, don't give up the fact you're a storyteller. Don't, turn into some kind of AI robot that says we are very important. You need to give to us. You're very important. That's not going to win people over. We tell them also, we have found over time that major donors or program officers are generally open to getting a phone call and preventing you from wasting your time and possibly wasting their time because they don't have any interest in supporting what you're doing. You're not a match. Okay, you're looking for matches, a common interest. We also tell people getting nonprofits is you build relationships based on professionalism and trust. You show up on time, you are respectful, you do your job well, they'll do it too. The other thing is people who give away money or make grants or whatever are incredibly busy. I've seldom dealt with a foundation that was adequately staffed. So they're just really, I walked into one program officer's office in the late 1990s before things were really getting digital. And I was glad that she was willing to meet with me in New York City because I walked into her office and I saw stacks and stacks of grant applications that she and her assistant were going through. They're on the window ledge, they're on chairs. And she says, I'm not sure I got your grant application. And fortunately, I kind of recognized that package. And I said, no, I'm over there and, stack 4, about 3 down. And that made a big difference. And then the other thing that is in this pep talk we do with people is you need to follow up after meetings with a note and a thank you. Even hard copy notes are very persuasive in the world of donors and relationships. And it's a really good thing to do. And the best people I know at fundraising and running businesses tend to do that. I once had a really valuable consultant. There's some consultants that are not as good as others. One particular one said, when you're raising money, you thank the person for meeting with you. As you leave, you thank them for talking with you. And when you get to the airport or wherever you are, you call back and saying, thank you so much. That was a very productive discussion. I really appreciate you taking the time. And then when you get a couple of days away, write the note. It's like, thank you is a very big deal thing. And I will finish this with this. The two most important words can often be just thank you. So this is another part of what is really a guide and a pep talk. If you don't get a grant or a donation on the first try, you keep trying if they don't totally shut you down. You see if a foundation or donor will accept another application or ask in the future. And you've got to remember there are good reasons for somebody saying no to you that really probably have nothing to do with the quality of your ask or your application. They may just want to see a longer track record, especially if you're a new nonprofit. The competition for that grant is just better. Sometimes others win the game. They wish they could have funded you, but they didn't have enough money this time, or they'd had some kind of mission shift. The general rules of the road, you need to always be appreciative of being considered. Never be bitter or entitled. I've been running into some people because everyone's stressed out right now over money and getting money, and there's some people that have actually yelled at a program officer for not giving them money. Amazing. It's like, well, that door's shut forever. Another thing I'm telling people when they're feeling a little desperate or short on funds, never exaggerate your accomplishments, especially when it comes to web traffic or audience. Your program officers and donors can look right through it. They know it's hard to have an audience. They know it's hard to get enough people to look at you. And another thing we tell people is if you get a grant, you just remember the program officer or the donor wants you to succeed. If they're asking some hard questions, it's because their reputation's on the line too. But you're on the team, so they're supporting you. And you just have to remember that. If you do well, they do well. You also need to remember the foundations and donors want to see impact, and you want to find out how they define impact. That can be a very tricky thing sometimes. There was at one point with the web coming along that I think a number of people are getting confused between audience and impact. Having a good audience is impactful, that's true, but you could do that with clickbait. You need to show that you're making a difference. That's what people really want to know about a nonprofit, is it making a difference. For the journalist, once again, we go to, like, what is your field? It's journalism, and most journalists have had a beat. So instead of thinking about this fundraising, getting donors to contribute, building membership, you treat it as an ongoing process. It's an ongoing process. As this consultant said to me, I liked it, was campaign is not a noun. That word is a verb. So you're constantly, always on the beat. Another thing to remember is foundations, even major donors, are in the same club. They're in the same industry. They will talk about you. You want them to talk well about you. Again, treating as a beat, you work as though you're in for the long haul. If you think you're going to parachute into a foundation and get a grant and never see them again, that won't work. And you want to stay in touch with them and let them know periodically how you're doing. We talk about in reporting, be politely persistent. Just don't go away. And the other thing is you research people and foundations you're asking money from, but you need to know the field. You need to stay up on what the field is doing and how things are changing. And then I'll finish with this. Again, two of the best words to use ever are thank you. I don't think in the United States we use thank you enough. So, thank you. Questions, thoughts, sharing of stuff? Yeah.
Talking about like when you do get to the point where you're asking for donations or like opening a law thing, is there like a general is there kind of an outline
Well, if it's foundations, there's a process. There is a difference between major donors or medium-sized donors and foundations are more formal. Okay, they've got to have procedures if they're a large foundation. They have a lot of money, they have a lot of legalities to be aware of, and so forth. So if at all possible, I have a conversation and making sure that what that particular nonprofit I may be working with is the kind of nonprofit they've given money to. And I may do the equivalent of a quiet interview, just like, where do you see the foundation going? What is it most interested in? So then when I'm going to, if it's a foundation, you get to the point they're going to accept a grant application. And some have melded the two together. One is a letter of inquiry, and that's like we're doing this, this, and this, and then they say, okay, we're ready for a full grant application. So that's more formal. You kind of work your way towards knowing that you're in the game, that they're interested. Major donors, a lot of times it's like a dinner and a lunch or a coffee. Where are you headed? Where are you interested in? Thank you for taking the meeting, for meeting with me. I want to make sure I tell you efficiently like what we're up to and where we're headed at this nonprofit. Sometimes everybody may want to know a strategic plan, which is a whole nother world. I've been involved with a lot of strategic plans that went on bookshelves. I don't want to do those strategic plans. So you want to have a strategic plan that makes sense. Like, we want to be in this place in 3 to 5 years, and quite frankly, you can help us get there. So I'm giving you sort of different conversations I've had. And the important part, the one other thing is really listening, which is really what you're supposed to do as a journalist, and we never do quite enough of it, but really listen to what they're interested in. Both for finding that common ground, but also going, I'm going to disappoint them. You have to know when to bail. So it's a process. There's no simple, yeah.
And I'll chime in with just a couple other things
Yeah.
that we talked about in fundraising fundamentals, especially for those major donors, starting out just by listening, finding out what their priorities are, and that's what you had mentioned. And then just some of the, effective techniques is when it is right to make the ask, and that could be after, that could be the third coffee, the third time you met with someone, asking it in a direct way. Would you consider a gift of $10,000 today to support X? And then a technique is that you remain silent. You let them talk next, and that's something that, especially if you're going into a meeting like that with like an executive director or a board member, you want to coach them so that they know to talk. Because then what happens is, the people asking for the money will start getting nervous. It's like, but if 10,000 is too much, then 5,000 would be great, and then you can just talk yourself out of a gift that they were ready to make, but you just need to remain quiet even though it's uncomfortable.
Well,
So,
and your research, you should know what the range is.
yeah.
Listening is really important, but reading stuff is really important. I've worked with journalists who initially, I couldn't believe it, and neither program officers, they hadn't looked at the foundation's website. Geez, who have they given money to, and what's the range of money? If they're giving something like the big ones, like $2 million over 2 years, you're not outrageous asking for $2 to $3 million. If their grants are normally $50,000 and you're asking for $200,000, one, they'll think that you did not do your research, and two, they'll think maybe you're just playing out of your mind because you're not on the same planet. So that's really important going in, and knowing that, I think, helps get over the nervousness when you're first asking for money. And the other thing is to know, in many cases, including foundations and donors, In some cases, you're kind of beginning the negotiations. They may have in their head, like, not a proven track record yet. Looks promising. We're going to give a 1-year grant. Remember, these are all like investments. You know, it's like playing the market. And they're just going to go. But, you know, things go right, we'll be open to extending this. And you just never know. Sometimes they'll say, you know, we've never given a grant to your profession before, this. And, you know, I always joke and say, it was always the first time, I don't know. And in fact, that's where it can happen. And they may say, well, why do you think it should be a first time? Well, because we're doing this work over here, and I've read your annual report, and I've looked at your grantees, and I think, you know, might give us a second look. I've gotten much more relaxed. You know, I've been doing it for 30 years, so I'm a little more relaxed about it. I've heard so many no's. I've heard so many maybes. You know, it's just, it's a process. And it might not be this year, might next year. You know, like I said, I learned early on, you're in it for the long haul. One thing that happens at foundations you have to be very aware of. When a foundation, a major foundation, gets a new president of the foundation, quite often there is a reassessment, a strategic plan, a look at the mission statement, and sometimes they change 20 degrees, sometimes it's just flips. So sometimes that's to an advantage, and sometimes it's not at all. You know, you have to keep up on current events. And there's also the language changes over time. There's certain keywords. Sustainability. I don't know when we'll get a new word for sustainability, but that's been heavy. And so it's good to know the vocabulary and what they mean by that vocabulary.
And especially with major donors also, some people are just really nervous about asking for money, and it just feels really uncomfortable. And for me, I just had to really frame it as this is an opportunity for them, and so I'm not going to kind of shortchange them on an opportunity to make an impact or an investment. I'm just going to be able to provide the information that they're looking for and be, you know, honest and transparent, and just help to kind of steward them, you know, through that process of deciding. And when you're lucky enough to have kind of an organized campaign, there's a gift range chart that organizations use, and it's usually kind of, you know, your major gifts, your mid-level gifts, and your kind of starter gifts. And that's a really great tool to use as you're, you know, as you're building a relationship. You have that, you know, document, and you can ask, you know, which level do you see yourself? You know, because it might be that the top level is 25,000 and above, and then the second level is 5,000 to, or, you know, 10,000 to 25,000, and then they can kind of signal kind of where they're, you know, where they're looking at. So you're not asking them necessarily for an exact dollar amount, but just kind of like in a range, just to kind of get a feel for what they're looking. And they might just offer up that dollar amount also, but yeah.
Well, one of the best pieces of advice or reminders I got one time, I was sort of getting through the early days of making asks and doing the grants. And they said, why should you be nervous? They know why you're there. You know, you may develop a relationship and a friendship over time to pass the time of day. But right now, they know exactly why you're there. We're not discussing why you're there and they're there. You're talking about what the amount of money is that's possible to support what you truly believe is a good cause and a good thing to do. So, you know, and they're used to people being nervous too, and they'd rather, let's get down to it. You know, they took the meeting, they're talking with you. You know, let's see how much you need and what your plan is. A lot of it is they just want to know you have a plan. that you just didn't happen on their website and saw that they gave similar money, and okay, if we get that, maybe we'll last another 3 months. They deal with a lot of desperate people too. Nonprofit, small business, half the small businesses in the U.S., according to one study, fail within 4 years. So they know everyone's nervous, and they know that all money is crucial. But again, they want to make an investment in something that's part of their mission, and they want you to succeed. And if you have a plan, that helps. So, but that really helped getting nervous. It's like, why are you here? I once had funders say, "It's fine. I've researched it. How much are you asking for it? What do you think is going to really help you?" And then I learned you always have that number. Yeah, this is what I would count on. I have my portfolio of grants and major donors and minor donors and and this is how it all fits together, and this is where we want to go. I think that's one of the things people new to the field don't get prepped enough, is they want to know where you're going. And so that helps a lot. But again, should never be nervous asking. Otherwise, they wouldn't have taken the meeting. They're just waiting. Imagine that life. It's just like wherever you go. It's one former program officer said to me. He said, "I couldn't believe how popular I was for that 10 years. I just the most popular person, and the phone never stopped ringing, the letters never stopped coming, and now I find out who I actually really got along with, and that's just fine because I knew that was my job, but I was so popular." Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever heard that saying, and sometimes this comes into play when you're going through that relationship building, and but it's if you ask for money, often you'll get advice, and if you ask for advice, often you'll get money. And so by asking for advice and engaging people in a meaningful way, will be more likely to lead to a gift, if you have that.
And once you start doing this, you're in the same field as they are, and so you want to share information about what's happening in the field too. So getting advice or just information, like I'm happy asking program officers what trends they're seeing, like where do you see things going, because they Mark Lavallee, who's here for the Mobile Me, will be talking about this. 3.5 years of being a program officer at a major foundation, he has this wide view of the journalism industry that few people have. There are probably maybe 20 program officers at different foundations who get to see all that's going on and through all these applications and all these discussions. And for me, that's what's incredibly valuable, not just to help nonprofits. It's a double bonus. I was working on a book over the last few years on changing models for journalism. I was doing some interviews basically with those folks. I wasn't asking for money, I was asking for wisdom. And that's part of what you were saying. They do have this wisdom of, they're seeing the forest. They see a lot of trees, but they see the forest, and that can really help you. You're not just like, complimenting them on being very wise because you want money. They really do know what's going on. So, are there questions?
Not everyone in here is a journalism major, but do we have about 3, or who are journalism majors?
Yeah. So, and I feel comfortable in this because I've gone to nonprofit events, and I encourage journalists to become nonprofit executives, or whatever you would say in journalism, to go to conferences or meetings with other people running nonprofits, so they can see they don't have to reinvent the wheel. This is a profession. There's a whole package of knowledge built up over time, and so finding that common ground. A few times that I've gotten a journalist like to go to the program. Indiana University has its School of Philanthropy, and they do a lot for professionals over the weekend classes over 4 weeks or whatever. And the journalists gone there, it's been eye-opening. I think they just jumped way ahead in their knowledge and realizing they're not, unique, and that all the things I'm talking about may be about journalism, but I ended up serving on a board for a local orchestra, and I've been involved with some other nonprofits. So all this is transferable knowledge. There's certain patterns. Every profession is a little different, but there's some real patterns to that. I've also served in a couple of organizations that have given relatively small but valuable grants, so I got a real good idea of it from that side. So anytime a journalist has gotten into the nonprofit world, has an opportunity to get on a grant-making group, even if it's community, it opens your eyes. It really opens your eyes what good behavior is, how you can come across better. So it's good to get on the other side of that.
Or journalism majors and other majors, have you been familiar with like nonprofit newsrooms, like what Brant is? Were you familiar that that was kind of a subsector of the nonprofit?
Probably not.
Because
It's,
honestly,
no, it's
I've heard when you mentioned like Mother Jones and
ProPublica.
I knew of them, but I didn't realize
Reveal.
that they were like under that umbrella. If that, kind of like a
Yeah,
nonprofit.
it's interesting. Journalism in general has been pretty bad at marketing itself, and it's difficult to market with all the noise now to distinguish yourself from different things. But finally, people are saying, it would be worth marketing it so that it would increase audience, because the people doing these nonprofits are extraordinarily dedicated, and it is the area of news that is really producing quality work and does not have to answer to shareholders. Part of the destruction of local news and news in general in the U.S. is the product of stockholders and hedge funds. There's a really good documentary out called Stripped for Parts, and it's how hedge funds have come in. They've decided hedge funds do this with all distressed industries. They size up what they call a distressed or dying industry, and they come in and sweep up all the last of the profits that they can. And so that's not friendly to us getting reliable news. They cut back on people. They sell the real estate. They'll be the first to use AI improperly. And so, it's time to market these 500, and there'll probably be 1,000 in a couple of years, because there's not yet a for-profit alternative, particularly for local news. So yeah, we've been talking about it. I'm no longer on that board, but there's a big concern. We've got to get the word out. Got a couple of free ads from New York Times last year, but that's, all the news is in various lanes now, or media. And so how you jump lanes or have more lanes to get your message out is much more difficult. So, yeah. And I was just at a conference where there's now yet a new network run by the Center for Community News in Vermont, and which is recognizing and networking all the college classrooms across the country. They're doing community news like it's being done here. And at this point, there are 172 those newsrooms, college classrooms, covering the community, the county, the city council, things like that. So it's a lot going on, and a lot of people have no idea unless they know somebody that's part of it. So yeah, that's a whole another issue, is how do you market yourself, and to whom? Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So when you're talking to like a potential donor or foundation, do you want to like acknowledge that there's competition, like talk about why you're better, or do you want to keep the conversation more focused on like your own nonprofit?
Yeah, I think talking why you're better is
Not better, but like why their money would maybe go towards better causes if it were to go to you.
I think you talk about the work you do. I think for a long time, especially in the nonprofit news movement, there's still a great sense of collaboration. I think the intensity of the life we're living right now has caused some people to diss other organizations. That doesn't go a long way. I mean, it's better to stress what you're doing. And in fact, lots of these newsrooms are working with each other because they're fairly small, and you need to combine resources to get certain kinds of news and stories done. So I think it's really better to say, this is what I do. And by the way, I play really well with others. And I can tell you that some of them are your current grantees. And in fact, a couple of foundations, as this Institute for Nonprofit News grew that network, they put on a grant application, are you a part of INN? So they want to see, they know that there are not a lot of resources out there for journalism like there were. So they want to see you working together, for this common good. It's a good question, because there's some people I've heard are not going to win friends and influence people by saying I'm better than so-and-so, and you're wasting your money with them. They're really terrible. That program officers are not impressed. It's like, you're sour grapes before you even lost, right? Yeah.
How important is it to have evidence, evaluation data, and emotional appeal?
Well, okay, so you've got your qualitative, you're telling the story of what you do and why it matters and the kind of impact you have. Anything that you can quantify is appreciated. Now, they may say, we want to know what your web traffic is or your social media traffic is. That doesn't mean that necessarily you want to see 1 million this or that, but they do want to know that you have an audience, an actual audience. They want to know what differences you've made in your work. In journalism, that's a little bit easier. There could be reform, finding fraud, waste, and abuse in something, and showing that, journalism goes two ways, right? One is it's progressive in that it helps the weak, the poor, the exploited. But it also has this other part it does is don't waste our money, don't waste taxpayers' money or whatever. So if you can show that you're having that impact or that kind of thing you're doing, and that it is your mission, that you are carrying out, mission statement's so important, and people struggle with mission statements. But if you could show you're in conformance with that quantitatively, that really helps. So I call it widgets. Everybody wants to know widgets. That's things you count. Count an audience, count your production of stories. Again, you're not running something that's always quantifiable because it's a nonprofit with a mission. But you do want to say what you're doing. You do want to have good finances. You want to show them that you understand the budget. That the budget you propose for the coming year is not delusional, right? You want to see realistic. So that's quantifiable. You have last year's budget, you have this year's budget. You saw they want quantifiable. They want to know you're going to be in business in 6 months. Does anyone know that about nonprofits? How much you generally a minimum should have in reserves? Has anyone heard that one? 6 months of financing. I consider that scary, but that's a rule of thumb. I'm like, oh my God. So, a lot of people, especially small nonprofits, run on the edge, and they want to know that you know that and that you're honest about it. Yeah.
Something that I thought of about that I had experience working at nonprofits, the difference, making sure that you and others, on your team have a clear understanding of like outputs and outcomes. So they want to know, funders may want to know both. But the difference is outputs is like we distributed X number of brochures. We have X number of followers on these social media sites. So that's your outputs. The outcome is the stories, the things that you can really demonstrate that you've had some achievements with and stuff, and that kind of helped me understand the difference, and how much more there's just a lot of value put on outcomes. And then the other thing that you had asked about, something that we're going to be working on this week is like value part of that is really what sets that nonprofit apart. So instead of, so it's good to know, they don't like to say this in the nonprofit world, competition, but there are, there's a finite, dollars, and sometimes you are competing with other organizations that do similar work. And, being able to understand your competition and know what you do differently is a great way to kind of frame it, as far as what sets you apart, what's, unique. And like the Refugee and Immigrant Association, it is that they are run, they're working with refugees and immigrants who are coming, who have been here in our communities less than 5 years, where the people running the nonprofit, they've been here for 15, 20, so they've already walked that path. So they're there to, it's not someone who looks like me who's working with a refugee from Ghana, and I'm, kind of, telling them what, kind of the resources and what is best for you. It's more so the people that walked in their path before and came to Iowa City 15 years ago as a refugee. They know the culture, they know how that person views certain things, and I think that's really unique about like Refugee and Immigrant Association, and also their board. 100% of their board gives money each month to cover salaries, lights, rent, and so everyone gives, and that's something that sets them apart, because your typical nonprofit board, many times, not everyone on the board is actually financially contributing to the organization.
Yeah, and that actually is a rule of the road, anything I'm involved in. I tell boards, every board member has to contribute. If you can only afford $1, I don't care, it's got to be 100%. That's one of the questions I get right away. So all your board members contribute. And the person asking it knows that there's some boards that are wealthy donors and great, and they can make up deficits and all that. Those might be more traditional boards, but there are other boards that are full of true believers that never made a whole lot of money. But you still got to, if you can't give the equivalent of a cup of coffee a week, you really need to think about why you should be on the board. Because I've had board members, new board members say to me sometimes, I'm doing all this volunteer work, why should I have to contribute anything? I'm doing it all without pay. I said, well, because you're doing it for the belief in the cause. And furthermore, the foundation's going to say to me, why should I give money to your organization if your board members won't give a dime? And I learned that early on.
Yeah,
I had a board president once who wouldn't give,
yeah.
so I gave her name. I said, I'm not going to argue with you anymore. I'm just going to give you your name. Next time it came around, she gave.
Yeah, I've been with one organization that, especially if you're in a capital campaign or something, and you want to be able to say 100% of our board has contributed, and so there is, sometimes there is the executive director will make a donation in that individual's name just so that we can say that. And
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because so many, nonprofits, from having a set amount, everyone's expected to give $1,000 or $500 or $100. Some of it is just right in the bylaws what the expectation is. Some are, I think it goes with the culture of the nonprofit also, but they'll say, give an annual gift that is meaningful to you. And so if there are people on the board for the ARC of East Central Iowa, and they always want to have some representation from a couple of clients, then they have clients who they're serving who have cognitive disabilities, and so they're something meaningful to them annually which is different than, you know, someone who is a major donor and known as a philanthropist in the community. Something that would be meaningful to them, you know, might be $25,000. So, and then there are other ones that do this give-get. You can either, you know, there might be an expectation of $1,000, and you can either give $1,000 or you can raise $1,000, and that goes to the organization. So you see them in all different.
And journalists are paid so well that, you know, there really aren't expectations on most of the boards. If you get non-journalists on the boards that have been in other areas of philanthropy, they basically come to understand we're in one group and the journalists on this board are not going to, you know, pay the price of admission that they're used to doing. So that's been another thing that's evolved over time, is sort of educating like major philanthropists that one of the reasons there are all these nonprofits is because there's just not a lot of profit, and you're dealing with a lot of people who've been underpaid for the amount of work they did for a long time because they believe in what they're doing. So, yeah, that's another part. But I'm now probably have served on maybe 20 boards over the last 15 years, just simply because I was popular, because I raised money, I knew journalism. But I've learned a lot of board stuff by doing that, and learned a lot about executive director and board relations and how to work well in terms of fundraising. You really need to be in sync on that. Your message in fundraising, you will have staff that are not doing fundraising, but they also need to know what the message is, because everybody's out there, and you want to make sure it's not like in lockstep, but you know, make sure they're familiar with the mission statement and what we've raised money for. They may run into somebody in their work and go, oh my God, you know, I should put them in touch with the executive director or the major fundraiser on the board. So I think it's really good to build up a camaraderie among staff and board. So, you know, people don't like to see unhappy organizations, you know, and they like to see them, you know, basically having the same message and the same kind of thing. That's the other thing, is nonprofits don't exist in a vacuum. They're not an abstract thing. We're out in communities, and you know, they need to see that we're one solid organization. When I'm not talking out of school really, because everyone knows I've said this before. When I became executive director at IRE, we've been through a tough time on whether to move to Maryland from Missouri, and a lot of disputes and so forth, and things have gotten pretty rough. And so I said to the staff, I said, the first thing we're going to do is say please and thank you. And we're going to answer the phone when it rings, and we're going to answer email when it comes in. We're just going to start basic politeness, and we're going to get happier because we're going to be making people happy. And it really did work. It sounds really dumb, but that really expanded into our fundraising efforts, because we are now a functioning, pretty well-balanced organization. Every organization has ups and downs, but the face of the organization was a much happier one. And that's another part that people sometimes forget in fundraising. Is you've got, you know, staff that's unhappy and beleaguered and burnt out. Who wants to give to that? So I got a much more, I don't like the word, but it was a much more holistic view of fundraising and donors. And you know, again, talking to staff, donors are supporters. You know, you need to thank them. Nobody owes you anything. And that once we got around that corner, I mean, membership went from 3,000 to 4,000 while I was there. Funders got enough faith in us that we had a major funder that supported an endowment drive that eventually raised $3 million for an operation that was $1 million a year. That's a lot of money to raise. It's now at $4 or $5 million. So, you know, you got to get people to have faith in you. I think that's one of the major things. There are other questions? I know that's kind of nuts and bolts and sometimes obvious, but yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about when you say work as though you're in the long haul, and what does that look like for the organization as a whole and as the executive director?
if you think you're in it for the long haul, or if you're a reporter and you treat it as a beat, it means, I think, that you behave in more consistent ways. Like, you know what, the grant didn't come in that day, or the donor just didn't have time that day. I'm not going to get upset about that. I'm concerned, but, I'm going to be around tomorrow and the next day. And, good executive directors have a lifespan of at least 10 years, and you should at least think 5. So you're around, and you're going to be around. And I think even when you're feeling really tired or burnt out, or just something's going on in life, you behave better if you're in it for the long haul. It also it portrays confidence in what you're doing and what the organization is doing. So, anybody's been in small business, you can be jazzed up every single day. I mean, it's just, there are not a lot of you, there are a lot of pressures, but if you go, we're going to have ups and downs, but when we total things up at the end of the year, we've done pretty well. That's where we want to be. And there are some, I know people who've talked to major donors for 4 or 5 years before they finally say, you know what, I think you're doing a good job. I wasn't sure, but you're still here, and I hear good things about you. So, it's an attitude. It also tells you that you've got to, as I said earlier, to repeat this, you need to stay up with current events in the field. You need to read the magazines. You need to chat with people. You need to talk to other people in the field. One thing I didn't mention that's helped a lot of people is sometimes they won't approach a funder, whether it's a donor or foundation, because they think that funder has given to the one thing that's similar to what they do. No, a lot of funders, they like to, put a lot of chips out on different places. Like anybody investing, they want to have a good portfolio. So they don't want to put their money all in one place in general. If you do that as a foundation, then you become an operating foundation. In other words, that nonprofit's an extension of you within a few years in the view of the IRS and everybody else. So they may want to have, say I'm doing a lot having to do with covering big ag. May have a funder that likes, I'd like put some money on them, on this organization, they do it slightly different. So I've had some people, well, they already gave to this cause. No, that may be the area they're going to get 4 or 5 different grants. So that's another thing I need people to think about. It may not be this year, but get in the game. Let them know you're around. Let them know what, every time you have a major success, let them know about it. That's the other thing is, you want to stay in touch, not too little, not too much. There's a rule of thumb somebody's been talking about, contact every 4 to 6 weeks. Something that the organization has done, a short note, something nice that goes to the person's funding. I've talked to program officers and foundations, and they're just amazed. They gave money to an organization, they didn't hear from them till the next year when it was grant time. I was stunned. I mean, they gave you money, they care about you, they like to know how you're doing, and they're busy. They're not going to just read your website or your social media automatically. They're not going to open your newsletter. But if they see a nice email or text of 3 paragraphs or 2, well, that's good. Okay, they're still there. And then if the funder wants to know more, you're ready. Yeah, I can send you a whole little report we did on this. But that's one other thing is, you got to stay in touch. And you can always say, if I'm bugging you, let me know. I don't think I've had one funder ever say that to me. Like, it's good to hear from you.
Denise, when I think of the long haul, I also think about strategy. Like, if you're just kind of running after the money truck, I just need money. That's not a good place to be in. You're going to get burnt out. But if you can actually build strategy and you can share that strategy with donors, I think that they'll see that potentially kind of equates to that long haul idea.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, you mentioned earlier about making sure staff know. So even if they're not fundraising staff, and this is, again, if you've taken fundraising fundamentals, we talk about the culture of philanthropy, and that you really want to educate your non-fundraising, non-communications, staff with talking points, and not, most nonprofits don't have enough bandwidth to have like an internal communications really robust, as far as like communicating with the whole organization, especially if they're just a small community-based nonprofit. But knowing that, like, I've used Four Oaks in the past as an example in their residential treatment center that houses like 100 children, annually, and they have, because they live there, they have a whole dining area they have a whole, kitchen and kitchen staff. Those individuals also need to be given some talking points, because they're all ambassadors, or they all have the potential to be ambassadors. And so just being able to, just not forget them, I think has been really important. And it's easy to forget them because you're just, you're really kind of focused.
And you bring up something else I think it's really important, and I've witnessed it, and I've had to correct it as a board president, is the desperation for money can come to such a degree that you have what's known as mission drift, which you touched on, you reminded me, which is chasing the dollar. It doesn't look good. It tells people you're probably in trouble. It messes up the whole organization, because you have a mission, the organization's going to take care of the kids, or it's going to report the news in a fair and equitable way, and suddenly you're like doing this, like something else that's unrelated, like maybe we'll start a little restaurant on the side or whatever. I mean, I've heard some crazy ideas, and I did have to deal with somebody that was like, well, why don't we provide training on covering politics? It was like, no, we're a network and of various nonprofits. That's not our game. Well, there's this grant out there for $100,000. It's like, no, that's not. I mean, there are these organizations doing a long time and doing it much better. So I think that's another part that. And there's a strange thing that will come up at a certain point, either because of that or because it's not a good match. You have to learn to say no matter how disappointing it is to money. Because if you're successful, you may have someone approach you with some big dollars to do something that you really don't know how to do or shouldn't be doing, don't have the skills to do. I've talked to executive directors and other boards, and I said, yeah, it hurts when you do that. I mean, your whole purpose is people value, but this place is coming in, this foundation, and you look like you have some of the skills to like set off and do this, but it has really nothing to do with that. And I know of another organization where the executive director didn't turn to the board, thought, hey, it's $500,000, it's kind of on mission, we'll do that. I've never been in a colder room than when the executive director bragged about getting, it was $600,000 to do something nobody knew was up. And I think she expected the board to clap in delight, and it was ice cold. It was just, I made a mental note, never do that. That's another thing is executive directors, is one rule with boards, no surprises. No matter how bad the news is, tell them. Don't let them find out bad news, and definitely give them all the good news you can. But mission drift can be a real issue.
And that's something that with Four Oaks, they had a board member who was a well-known community philanthropist, had capacity to give, $500,000 $1 million gifts, and he had been on the board for quite a while. His daughter had a child. She was on the autism spectrum, so he really wanted Four Oaks to start a program for.
It's a good sample.
Yeah, and Four Oaks, they do have a lot of different programs, but back then, it really was more like directly focused with, for people with mental health and behavioral health diagnoses. And so that board member, filtered in a lot of money to start this program, but then his granddaughter grew up, so she was utilizing the program, but then she grew up, she became an adult, and it was focused on children, and so he wanted to stop giving. And then we just had this big program that, he was our only funder. That's kind of bad on us. We didn't, maybe, but it was, again, it was that mission creep where it really was outside, what we were doing, and so the program was no longer, and, it just had to be closed down, so.
Yeah, so that's the other thing is you may get funders who want you to really scale up. That is to get bigger. Bigger is better, right? That's America, right? That's not necessarily something you have to do. I've seen at least a couple of nonprofits collapse of their own weight because they got so big. If you get to a certain level and you have to sustain it every year, then that's big responsibility. And that's happened in a number of industries, professions, and nonprofits. So, if it's $2 million a year or $1 million a year gets the job done, be careful about somebody coming in and giving you money that's not going to be there in 3 years or 2 years or whatever. I have to say, when I got into doing this, I constantly heard that foundations are fickle. You're popular with them for 2 years and they dump you, and they don't like that. My experience, especially during this nonprofit movement in journalism, is they've really stuck with this because they can see a continual need and problem. And that's the other thing is, you can phrase how you make your pitch for money, but they always want to hear, how did you quantify or how did you identify the need that you're taking care of? They even want to know how you decided this was a need. So if you take something like a nonprofit I'm very involved with called Investigative Midwest, the big ag one, I could easily say there used to be 500 agricultural reporters in the Midwest, and there are now 10. I'm exaggerating, but it was huge. There was a Chicago Tribune for a while had no one covering agriculture, Des Moines, and so forth. So one of the whole ideas of a pitch is always keeping in mind, we're not doing this because we had a thought one day. We had a thought maybe, but we actually checked and see if there was a big gap or a big need. And get back to your point, quantifying that really, really helps. So that's another part. So, other questions? Anybody? I know it's a lot of shop talk, but I sort of learned on the job. I did go to a couple of things, and the School of Philanthropy is good for professionals. I really recommend that. They had one I went to, and the person had been in nonprofits deeply, for 20 years, and then became a professor. And she was a great problem solver. I went and said, this board's having trouble with his executive director, described it. She was like, he's gone. I can see the future in the next 6 months or whatever, he's going to be gone. You better start working on your PR. You better, why did you separate because of difference in mission or whatever? But it's great to talk to people who've been around for a long time. They just, they just relax and tell you, here it goes, it's by the numbers. This is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, and unless you get lucky, it's going to resolve itself that way. So get over it, move on. But there's nothing like finding experienced people.
We just have a few more minutes left.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions?
Anything? Yeah.
Could you talk a little more about digital innovation? You talked about some new tools for news gathering and new channels for distributing
Well,
information?
I'll jump to, like, I get a theme every year or two. I just, like, I'm, a little obsessive. You have to be investigative. I think, particularly journalism, but in general, a number of industries, not all, are having problems with realizing that we're starting everything on the phone. Our life is on the phone, everything. In news, this is easy to say to people, and that's why we do this conference called Mobile Me&You. For more than 10 years, we've been saying, I'm happy you have a really good website, and it looks prettier than it did last year. But no one's starting there, okay? They're starting on this phone, and they're starting with streaming. And so I've all digital, I got into technology deeply because I was teaching people how to use spreadsheets and database managers and maps and visualizing data for journalism. So I sort of reluctantly got deep into that, and then I appreciate that, this is it. And when the web came along, that's fine. But I think in digital innovation now, we're going through another change, and we really need to realize how that's happening. I mean, I know how many people are watching influencers more than they're reading news or viewing news or anything. I'm saying to everybody, there's no shame in maybe getting somebody who you consider your influencer for your organization, because that's where people are. I was at Night Media Forum annual conference 2 years ago and last year, but they bring all these funders and nonprofit news people together, which is just great for mixing it up. But one of the, I'll make it quick, one of the panels was 3 influencers. So I've been talking to people who've been talking about their web traffic increasing. There's newsletters now. I've got 20,000 people opening a newsletter and all that. Those influencers got up there, and each one of them said, well, I've made the standard. I have 1 million people now per audience. Another one said, well, I'm getting close. I'm 900,000. And the other one said, well, I just started last year, but up to 700,000. And I just saw all the faces in the room kind of blanch, like we're not up to speed. So I would say out of everything, if every strategy begins with the phone, with the mobile device, and think streaming and not sort of geometrical design on a website. Yes, you want to have that, but start with the idea. This is where they're going to meet you, especially in fundraising. Yep.
Yeah, great. Well,
Okay.
thank you so very much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the questions.